And I hear this line all the time that I'm not anti-Semitic. I just don't like the government of Israel. And it really is a very thin line. I just don't like Israel. I'm actually against Zionism. I'm actually really not against the Jewish people, but I'm against Zionism. So you don't think they should have a home in the way that you have a home. So you don't think that they're worthy building a free and open democracy. I am a profound believer in country of Israel as a democracy in the Middle East.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Western Spirit from Israel. I'm Ariel Whitman, and today with us we have someone very special. John Anderson is a former Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and he now hosts an amazing podcast, which I read it, I said it's Australia's premier podcast, but I think it's the world's premier podcast because I'm in Israel. I watched it. My dad's in America. He watches you. So, John Anderson, it's a true honor to finally speak with you.
It's an honor to be with you, and I am a profound believer in the country of Israel as a democracy in the Middle East and its people.
Thank you. We appreciate it. And it's, again, really an honor to speak with you. So I wanted to start with what's happening in your country. I have a friend, Arsen Ostrovsky, who I knew, we're friendly in Israel. Now he moved to Australia like 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks in, he gets shot in the head in Sydney. What's happening? How do you explain? Australia used to be so... I have friends that grew up in Australia. It was an amazing place for Jewish people. And ever since October 7th, the opposite is true.
I'm deeply, deeply troubled by what has happened here in recent times. I didn't see it coming. The first time I saw the visceral effect of rising anti-Semitism on the mental and personal health of an individual was in London 6 years ago, when a very dear friend of mine who happens to be Jewish broke down over lunch and explained what was coming. She was one of those people who's very deeply plugged in and knows what is happening. And it was really confronting because I've always thought of this country as one where amongst the democracies, the Jewish people have thrived, have been absolutely magnificent contributors by and large. There's certainly, just as there are Americans I don't like and British I don't like and other people who have come here that I might disagree with politically or in terms of the sort of art they like or whatever, but overwhelmingly, Jewish people have been massive contributors. Our most famous general, probably one of the greatest generals of all times, Sir John Monash from Melbourne, was a Jewish person. Two of our most famed governors general, Queen's representative in Australia, have been Jewish. You look at their contributions in business, in politics, in the arts, in construction, in property. It's really quite remarkable. And to have gone from a place where I think amongst the democracies, there could have been no better place for a Jewish person to live, enjoy their lives, raise their families, interact with their communities, to, amongst the democracies at least, one of the worst, is mind-boggling to me. And I have to say I'm quite contemptuous of some of the people who should have known better in this country that have allowed all of this to flourish, if that's the word, given that the left was playing around with it, we now know, for a long time, behaving stupidly, and nobody took much notice. Then we realised just how full of this stuff our universities in particular were. And I'm going to be very blunt here and say too many people in the educated, wealthy suburbs who ought to darn well know better have soaked that stuff up in their universities.
And what about your political system? So I know that I've been reading that your prime minister was booed, I think it was yesterday, when he came to the scene of the attack. And it seems that, well, here in Israel, we were very, I guess, in conflict with your government because of the recognition of Palestine as a state, but also because I think like 3 months ago, our prime minister actually sent a letter to your prime minister saying like Jews are in danger, take it more seriously. And instead of, I guess, responding in a thoughtful, meaningful manner, it was basically like laughed out, like, who are you to say everything's okay? And then we see what happens 3 months later. So I know it's not comfortable to ask people in other countries to criticize their leaders to in other, media sources of other countries, but at the same time, my friends are Jewish and in Australia, and they're in danger, I guess. And so how should we look at your government at this point?
Let me say that I'm very aware. In fact, I've just spoken to a Jewish friend before this on Zoom that the Israeli people are, to put it kindly, troubled, unhappy. Well, let's be blunt. Many of them are probably very angry with what they've seen as the change of policy by the current government in Australia. Since 1948, in broad terms, it's fair to say there's been a bipartisanship, support for Israel, its existence and its people, its democracy, a celebration of what it's achieved, a respect really for the way in which you've made the desert bloom, if I can put it that way. Those who know and understand, I think, a delight that the Jewish people have a homeland at last. I don't know how many countries there are around the world, but it's probably 70, 80 or 90 that have essentially Judeo-Christian roots. There's the irony of it. And there are maybe 30, 40 former Foreign Affairs Minister makes this point, Alexander Dow, of Islamic descent. There's one Jewish state, and that's the one everybody wants to get rid of. I mean, good grief, get a life. So you've had this actual switch in the bipartisan, or the breakdown of the bipartisan approach. And the Labor Party really, from very early on, it was evident that they wanted to recognise Palestine, which I think is a very retrograde step. They've been offered recognition quite a few times. They themselves have rejected it. They are plainly not ready for it by any circumstance. They're plainly deeply divided. You're trying to create something that can't exist at this point in time. And in pretending that you can, you're not only perpetuating a fraud, you're actually handing a publicity victory to the hideous terrorists called Hamas and their backers in Iran and other places. Then, of course, when October 7th happened, before Israel had responded, we saw the horror of pro-Palestinian marches. And we had senior clerics declaring tears of joy are flowing down my cheeks because of this happened. You might be able to explain something. If you Google, is it legitimate for an Islamic person of Islamic faith to kill an innocent? And artificial intelligence will say, no, absolutely not. It's evil and wrong, and Allah does not allow the killing of the innocents. How then do you describe the Israelis? Because it seems that many devout radical Muslims actually disobey that pretty blatantly. They think it's all right. You may have a view on that.
Well, I
But
guess
it's progressed. Sorry,
yeah, I agree.
I'll let you go.
You asked, so I think the reason, if you remember, after October 7th, they called everyone that was killed a settler. So even if you're a peacenik who was driving people from Gaza to Israeli hospitals and volunteering and employing Gazans in your kibbutzim, and you were basically a communist, you were still a settler, because that gives you the legitimacy to say that they're not innocent. And so if you're a Jew that lives in Israel and supports, I guess, self-determination of the Jewish people and their ancestral homeland, you, by definition, by these people are not innocent. So therefore, the whole premise that you can't kill innocents just goes out the window at that point. Because even my 1-year-old, I have 3 children, a 4, 3, and 1. For them, he's not innocent. He's a settler, just like a soldier is. So we're all, and you can see it also in the way they treated the hostages, in the sense that if you were a hostage, even if you were caught at the Nova Festival, so you're like 25 and you're dancing at the festival, you get kidnapped, they treated those people as soldiers just because they were the ages of people in the army, even though they weren't in the army anymore. So they treat you as either a potential soldier. So if you're a child, you're going to be in the army one day, and therefore you're a legitimate target. And if you were in the army and you're in the age, even if you're not there anymore, you're a target. So everyone is not innocent for them. So it just goes out the window, the whole, which is why I don't, at least for the terrorist or the radical Islamist portion, I don't think we can say that we're innocent for them. We're all legitimate targets. It's scary, but that's how it is.
But as you make the perfectly legitimate point, your children are not settlers. They haven't
Right,
had that
exactly.
opportunity to be
No one
settlers
was settlers that day.
or
It's recognized.
colonizers.
Yeah, exactly.
This is this silly Western notion, and it is silly, from critical
Exactly.
theory, that the dividing line between good and evil is not somewhere across every human heart, but it's between those oppressor, colonizer type people who always turn out to be white
Yes.
in their language.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and a question asked in all innocence, do you think of Jewish people as white or as dark?
It's a good
There are
question.
Jewish people with very dark skin.
My
But
wife.
it's tied. People will say, what are you talking about? It's critical theory, though. Critical theory is the idea that the greatest evil of all is white supremacy, white racism, and the way in which they have evidence of their sinfulness is in colonialism. And so suddenly Israel is a colonizing state. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Ariel, but actually there were Jewish people in Israel thousands of years
Yes.
before the Muhammad even lived.
Yes. And not only that, John Anderson, there was, my wife is Iraqi and Persian. And nowadays, almost all of I would say more than, I think it was last time I checked, 60% of Israelis are from Arab country descent. So either Iraqi, Moroccan, Persian, Ethiopian, so black Jews. There's about 100,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel. So most Israelis are definitionally not ethnically white, but because, like you said, the left, the critical theory looks at them as white. So you have an Ethiopian Jew, but because of the way these people think, that black Jew is more white than a brown Arab. So it's a very weird thing, but that's how they do it.
It's been a complete revolution on the left. I mean, there was a certain nobility, I think, on the part of many on the left. That you may surprise you that I say that, but I think it's true. I would have thought that a lot of the left, the people that would have thought of themselves as not right or right of centre in the 1950s and 60s, were supporting the end of Jimmy Crow in America. And of course, their great champion, a remarkable man, flawed man, but a remarkable man. Those words, I mean, I know they're hackneyed, but they are so powerful. I look forward to the day when my children are judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. Well, the left has now turned that completely on its head. It's complete revolution, not just partial, complete. You will not now be judged according to your deeds. You'll be judged according to the colour of your skin or your gender or your politically correct views or whether or not you conform. And I find in this the overwhelming evidence that, if you like, intelligence and wisdom are frequently unacquainted. And I don't think you can have, I think one thing that Jews and Christians would agree on is that wisdom begins with the fear of God, a sense of awe, a sense of respect for the greater. Nothing more dangerous or more troubling than a human being who thinks they're not accountable to anybody except themselves. Overwhelmingly, when they decide they're God over their own lives, they want to be God over everybody else as well, or at least lock themselves into such selfishness that they're miserable and hardly contribute to society. I know those are tough judgments, but I also think, though, I'm a profound believer that a short route to foolishness is to ignore the lessons of history. And I'm amazed at how the distortion of history has been used to justify the willful ignorance, if you like, that has often surrounded everything that's happened in Israel. And I hear this line all the time that, oh, well, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just don't like the government of Israel. And it really is a very thin line. I just don't like Israel. I'm actually against Zionism. I'm actually really not against the Jewish people, but I'm against. So you don't think they should have a home in the way that you have a home? So you don't think that they're worthy of building a free and open democracy? Uh, I mean, we have a foreign minister here who, by dint of her personal life, would not be safe in Palestine. She wouldn't be safe there, and yet,
Why? Because she's gay?
yeah, well, that's my understanding.
Okay.
And we have queers for Palestine all over
Yes.
the place. I mean, this is how powerful this colonizer sort of idea is.
Yeah.
And
And
I have to say that I find it mind-boggling that our foreign minister did not visit Israel until a very long time after October 7th, and then did not go to the scene of the atrocities.
yes, which is amazing.
And as
Yeah.
always, has pushed this idea we ought to recognize Palestine, that, you know, uh, the words are always carefully chosen, but it has created a permission environment for the rise of ugly anti-Semitism, even though I don't actually think anti-Semitism is a fundamental problem that we're confronting in Australia.
I agree. And John, can I ask you something very like after October 7th, the day after at the Sydney Opera House, I think it was, they were chanting like gas the Jews. Then there was a whole issue whether it was exactly gas the Jews or kill the Jews or get the Jews. They were arguing about it for days, maybe even months, about what exactly was said. And I don't think it really matters exactly what was said. The fact is that it wasn't. Let's say if I'm Jewish, I wouldn't feel welcome there. Let's put it that way. And then it seems to me that, and I've spoken with a lot of Australian Jews and also not Jews, that there's a sort of reluctance by the authorities to call out, I would say, Islamic anti-Semitism or Muslim anti-Semitism because of the fear of being called maybe a racist or an Islamophobe. It's the same thing where I grew up in New York. There's a sort of people are worried about looking at you in a bad way, or even for some politicians electorally, it could hurt them. So, do you think there's any truth to what I just said?
Oh, absolutely. Evidently there is. I don't know that I've heard the Prime Minister use the term radical Islam even to this point in time. He may have, but he's certainly been very reluctant to. I don't think I've heard the Foreign Minister use the term. I'm not sure Tony Burke tries to avoid it because he has a seat in Western Sydney. So you've got, I think if you go back 40 odd years, you had around 100,000 Jewish Australians and about 100,000 Muslim Australians. It's now 100, 120 Jewish people. And around 1 million Muslim people. And so those votes, I suppose, become important. But my goodness, where's your moral compass if votes dictate your calling out of something that is evidently a problem and is very evil? Now, Henry Ergas is Australia's leading public intellectual, I would have thought. And he's just written an article saying this has absolutely smashed multiculturalism. That for years we assumed that we could pretend that people could come here from any culture and that our core culture would be strong enough somehow or other to ensure that our essential values, not that anybody talked about them except vaguely Aussie values. Well, what is the core Aussie value? Actually, the core Aussie value, when you stop and think about it in philosophical terms, is the core value of every participatory democracy. It is this: the equality of every citizen in terms of their right to vote, in terms of their standing before the law, in terms of what Bob Menzies, our longest-serving Prime Minister, said, democracy is not a machine, it's more a spirit in which no matter your place, rank, wealth, whatever in society, all souls are equal in the eyes of heaven. It goes back, if you like, to a fundamental Judeo-Christian concept around the sanctity and the value of each life and our need to respect them. Doesn't mean you have to necessarily agree with them. Often we don't. In fact, it becomes more important than ever to hold to that value system when you disagree. And I'm one who says we shouldn't bury disagreement. the modern tendency. What we actually ought to do is, in the Jewish model, I think, disagree more often and more virulently without personalizing it, argue more, disagree more, and disagree better. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said that to me once. He said that's how Jewish people resolve issues. They all appear to be yelling and excited and, very colourful exchanges. And a foreigner might say, do these people ever stop bickering? But he said that is actually the way they resolve their differences and find common ground. So this issue of multiculturalism is very, very important, because the man in the street in Australia now says, well, if this is multiculturalism, I don't support it. And the man in the street is saying, if you think it's about guns and you want to cast another long shadow over Australians who have guns, most of whom are decent, law-abiding citizens, whilst you ignore the people who are really behind this evil, you want to stigmatise me, but you want to ignore, you won't call out the fundamental problem here that we have to talk about. What you're actually going to do is two things. You're going to divide the community more. You're going to actually, I think perversely, build the very thing progressives say they hate, that American attitude towards guns that says, well, if you're not going to go after the really bad people, who's going to look after me? And then people start to say, I need guns in case I need to defend myself, law into my own hands. People don't think this stuff through. And Ariel, what really, I'm not, I don't claim that I'm not some super brain. Some of your listeners will say, no, he's certainly not. I'll say, no, he's as thick as they come. I don't know what they want to say. But I have to say, I'm reminded all the time when it comes to, every time I see some sort of, intellectual justifying their position on a lot of this stuff, I think of the old saying, the author of 1984, it was, Mental Block. Help me.
George Orwell.
George Orwell, I think it was he.
Yeah.
Who said of something that was floating around, that is such a stupid idea that only a member of the intelligentsia would believe it for a moment. The person in the street would see straight through it. There's a lot of that going about at the moment in Australia and in the West more generally.
Yes, I just want one thing that you wrote, or you were interviewed, I saw on GB News, and you said that you warned of they phrased it, the demise of Judeo-Christian culture in Australia and in the rest of the West, and you questioned how Albanese can sustain democracy. So can you a little bit explain, number one, why you think that we're at a place now where we weren't, let's say, 5 years ago, in where you're really worried about Western, I guess, Judeo-Christian culture and values being overrun? Is it just multiculturalism that we let in a lot of people?
No.
Or
No.
is it, and can I, before you answer, maybe propose my idea, that it's not just that we let in a lot of people, it's that we're ashamed of our own culture, therefore we're not willing to fight for it. Meaning, if you asked a Brit, for example, and I think there's new polls that show this, young Brits are not proud to be British. Or if you ask an American, young Americans, they're a lot less proud than their fathers were. And so I think that just, if you're not proud of something, why should you fight for it? If you don't know why you're there or why it's important, why should you feel that it's something worth fighting for? And then when people come in, for example, from radical Islamic ideologies, they believe what they say. Ayan Hirsi Ali told, they believe. She says that's why they're the most dangerous, because they really believe in their righteousness, whether we believe it or not. We don't. Is that something, does that make any sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've driven at the heart of it. We lack all conviction. The centre cannot hold, as W.B. Yeats had it. The centre can't hold because we lack conviction, but we're opposed by people who are very sure of their position. I've been thinking a lot, and the interview you're talking about, what I had in mind was the extraordinary American Thomas Sowell. And he commented recently, I think it was relatively, I certainly only found it recently, that, and he's absolutely right, civilization doesn't just fall out of the sky. It doesn't just happen. It has to be painstakingly built. It must then be maintained. It must, if necessary, be defended. But he said, above all, it must be understood. And if you don't understand it, collapse is inevitable. And he went on to say, we haven't been paying the rent. and the landlord sooner or later shows up. Well, I would say the landlord turned up for a very, very hideous down payment on our peaceful Bondi Beach with what happened. Because I actually think the fundamental problem here is not, as I said, guns. It's not anti-Semitism. It's not actually radical Islam. It's the complete loss of an understanding of our own core values. And in that, is what has actually happened is a loathing of our core values in many ways. We don't believe in the institutions of freedoms. We don't believe in the people in them. Trust has broken down extraordinarily in every Western society, including ours. But we don't even believe in the ideas or the beliefs that drove the values that drove the building of the institutions. We reject them in often profound ignorance because we've not been taught them at school, we've not been taught them at university, we've not even been taught them at home. And that's because in many ways you can't understand these things, unfortunately, without going back to the, if you like, the core teachings, even the scriptures of our culture, because they are Judeo and Christian. They are. Point me to a democracy, really, that wasn't the result of profound Christian input. And I would include places like India and Japan in that, frankly. If you take Japan, it was not a democracy until General MacArthur, in his generosity as an American, pointed the way to a much greater level of enlightenment, and they embraced democracy. But overwhelmingly, the places that are good places to live, where democracy reigns, where people have equal standing, where people have a say at the point of a pencil, not a gun, and the ones that have been prosperous are in fact the ones that are deeply rooted in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures.
Yeah. And can I want to propose something, and I want to get what you think about it. The downfall of religion in the West. So when I was growing up in America some 30 years ago, everyone, or even in New York, most people went to church. It was just a thing. Every Sunday, I was an ultra Orthodox Jew. I had the whole hat, jacket, beard, the whole uniform. But we would walk by, and every Sunday as I was going to school, because we observed the Hebrew Sabbath on Saturday. But we would see all of the Christians going to church. And I was there a few months ago, and it seemed like no one was going to church. And then when you also look at the statistics in the West, in Europe, it's much worse. But even in the US, there's a total decline of people, not only who believe, but even those who believe aren't attending any church, anything, it seems. And so, like you said, doesn't that also show why there's a lack of people understanding our values, but also a lack of community and caring one for the other? Because I think church, synagogue, even the mosque are places where you'll meet people that are like-minded. You'll meet friends. You'll meet your spouse. There's none of that anymore for young people.
Well, what you say is really very interesting, and it's worth noting that Richard. Well, let me backtrack for a moment. After September the 11th, 2001, you saw a great outpouring from the intelligentsia about this is all the problem of religion. And the new atheism, there's nothing new about the new atheism. I studied late modern European history at university, and, was particularly interested in the sociological theories that arose out of Darwinism, which were sort of became a cause celeb for people who wanted to say, well, you don't need God anymore. And what was really noticeable then was what people would believe in the absence of God. Well, this is what Dawkins himself, one of the new atheists, said. I thought it was a time for reason, putting superstition aside, despite the surveys that actually show you're likely to be more rational and more reasoned and more balanced if you have a Christian or a religious faith. That's one of the interesting things about it, because as Dawkins has now noted, and as G.K. Chesterton said, and C.S. Lewis said, when you say you stop believing in God, it's not that you stop believing in anything. It's that you start to believe in anything. That's what happens. So Dawkins is troubled by now the rejection of science, and emotional sort of "I wish it were true" tends to take precedence over evidence and science in many people's minds. So this is where we've got to. And to be really frank, I mean, I don't want to sound in any way anything other than deeply saddened by this, but if you seek the monument to this incredible blunder, as Solzhenitsyn put it in 1978 in America, of forgetting God, look around you. There's not a Western country that's doing well. There isn't one. We've endlessly talked rights. We've endlessly talked up our ability to live selfishly, vicariously for ourselves, be God over our own lives, and to reject the idea that we should love God and love our neighbour. And I would say that the result has been tragic and deeply worrying. However, what is interesting is that you're now seeing an extraordinary surge in faith. I gather in Britain, amongst particularly Generation Z
Yes.
young men. I understand
Also
that
in the U.S. after Charlie Kirk, because a lot of people started going to church, young kids.
even before that, I understand the number of young males in Britain going to church has quadrupled over the last
Wow.
4 or 5 years. Quadrupled. And, you're seeing the same thing in America. One of the things that does worry me, Ariel, and I'm not sure if you're seeing it in Israel, something of a bifurcation happening. Young men are recentering, even becoming more conservative. Some of them are becoming loopy conservative. I think that's one of the real dangers in Charlie Kirk's death. There'll be some who'll say, well, he might have wanted to turn the other cheek, and look where that got him. So we're the war, the progressives declared war on us, so we'll damn well declare war on them. And I don't think that works. But the other thing I was really alluding to here that worries me is that there's more than a little bit of evidence that as young men become more conservative, young women are becoming more progressive, in inverted commas. A.N. Hirsiali talks of the dangers of turning our democracies into emocracy, where we feel everything and think nothing through properly. And when it comes to the great cultural issues, I'm with Churchill. You can't work out where you are if you don't know where you've come from. And if you don't know where you are, you don't know where to go to. And that seems to be where we're at.
Yeah. One more thing about this, I guess, overarching topic is immigration. It seems that the entire Western world, including Australia, where you are, is grappling with, I guess, the mass migration coupled with people coming from, I don't know if are we allowed to say backward countries, the third world? I think we are. I mean, I guess there are podcasts where people would say I'm a racist, but I think it's people are leaving certain countries and cultures to come to the West, and I think there's a reason why the immigration is going in one direction and not the other. So I think we're allowed to notice it. So I'm going out on a limb here. So how do you look, I guess, first of all, at Australia's immigration situation? Because for years, I remember Australia was putting illegal immigrants in islands, if I remember correctly. You guys were very tough on this. And now, I don't know, it seems like that's it. It's open, except for my friend who was banned from coming to Australia because he had 3 posts on X that were deemed problematic by your, I guess, foreign office or something, and he was banned from coming to speak. To and there was also Ayelet Shaked that was banned, former minister of Israel. So how do, how do they decide, first of all, who's banned and who's not, and secondly, how do you look at the entire immigration situation?
Again, I think it's a function of a loss of belief in our own cultures that shows up in many, many ways. One of them that's very interesting to me is, and you can track this, you talked about America changing. The research there shows that the number of Americans who feel proud to be America has gone from about 75 down to about 30, 35 in the last 25 years. The number of Americans who think religion is important has similarly halved, and the number of Americans who think that having children is important has halved. More people think it's not important than think it's important. And so, and by the way, you're quite right. I think about roughly 75% of Americans over 70 or baby boomer Americans are still think America's something worth being proud of, and only about 15% of Generation Z. And that's because we've allowed academics to, and they teach the teachers, of course, to denigrate our cultures. Anecdotal only, but it did happen. The Vietnamese have made a magnificent contribution to Australia. I admire them so much. They work so hard. They're so diligent. They're such good citizens. But a man and his wife brought their two children to Vietnam. And they're now Australian citizens. And the dad said to the two children, I want you to study very hard at school, not just to be successful, but because this is a wonderful place and we want to contribute to it, which is what the Vietnamese do overwhelmingly. And the children started coming home, Dad, this isn't a wonderful place at all. They teach us at school that it's a terrible place. It's an illegitimate place, that it's it's a brutal colonization and what have you. So there you have it. I think that pattern is being repeated. So if you don't believe in your own culture, but somehow you've still got these sort of misguided, we should be nice to everybody ideas, our culture is not particularly valuable. You'll even hear leftists now saying, well, if it's relevant in their culture, maybe cannibalism, we shouldn't be so critical of it. Well, come on. Not all cultures are equal. They're not all the same, and they're not all equal. A culture that doesn't value women as much as men, for example, is incompatible with ours. A culture that will not recognize the fundamental basis of democracy, the equality of all, is not compatible with a culture that says every citizen matters. And the plain reality is that we have people in our culture who do not believe in the equality of the Jewish people in our midst. They don't believe in the equality of the Jewish people in Australia. Well, that's incompatible with our democracy. And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the wellspring of that sort of view, and we must keep in mind, of course, that it isn't just Jewish people and not just Christians that radical Islams will take on. I mean, they often slaughter their own Muslims. They will often behead people that they regard as infidels in their own ranks. And they behave, and we need to remember and look at what happens to, actually, to be fair, the Waringas, the Islamic people who are being persecuted in Myanmar and forced out, and many of them reduced to slavery in places like Thailand. I don't know why we don't get more upset about these issues, but all we seem to want to do is march across the bridge, protesting the IDF, death to the IDF. Well, that's lovely, isn't it? Why not death to Hamas terrorists who have slaughtered in such horrific ways, such barbaric ways, such ways that go so far beyond any contemplation of how you would treat an enemy if you were a humane and civilized human being. Rules of law, the Geneva Convention, they are a recognition that war is always evil, but sometimes the alternatives are worse. Well, let's try and draw some limits around what we might do to women and children. Does Hamas respect any of that? Oh, no. It's only Israel that starves people. And then what happens? You find all the baby formula that's been provided locked up by Hamas out in a colony, in a tunnel somewhere, reflecting. Anyway, I need hardly reinforce your prejudices on this. Nobody says that what the IDF or what the Israeli government has done is perfect. I don't know. Not everything the Australian government has done is perfect. Not everything I've done is perfect. But this inability to understand how to balance these things properly on an informed basis is unforgivable.
Yes. And I have another, I want to give you a little bit of personal and anecdote and tell me what you think. So we seem to have basically worship people who are victims. And I think that translates to also the way people in the intelligentsia look at Israel in the West. So Israel is the strong, the Palestinians are the victims, and therefore the victims must be the righteous side in this story, even though they're not. And by the way, the Talmud actually says that if you're poor, it doesn't mean you're automatically in the right, and if you're rich, it doesn't mean you're automatically in the wrong. It specifically says that. And the reason why it's interesting to me is that we spoke a little bit before about me losing my eyesight. And I remember when it happened, there was a sort of split decision within the first few days when they said, you're going blind. And I went to this group of people who are, support groups. And there was basically half half. So half of the people left their jobs when they knew they were going blind and went on welfare. They just left. They gave up and they made themselves victims in the way they looked at themselves and their lives. And then the other half decided to fight through and try to make something of themselves, even though it was going to be that much more difficult. And it seemed to be, didn't feel sorry for themselves. And when you looked at, roughly speaking, those two groups, you can see who was happy and who was not so happy. But you can also see, if you're someone coming into the group, who you would feel more sympathy to. You would be sympathetic to those people who felt sorry for themselves. So I think in a larger picture, that's the dynamic of what we're seeing in the world stage. I sorry to take it to my own story, but when you look at the way people in the West decide who they support and who they don't, not just in Israel, in politics and in celebrity culture, they're always going to support nowadays the people who are the most victims, the racial victims, the sexual victims, the LGBTQ. It's very, how do you look at victim culture in that? Do you agree with me, first of all?
Well, a very thoughtful and intellectually gifted and widely read old Labor man in this country said to me that he loved the Labor Party when they were about universalism, lifting up the oppressed, the marginalised, the poor, so that they were fully part of family Australia. And he went on to say, now the Australian Labor Party, and he was a Labor man, it's not me saying this, elevates victims to the status of aristocracy and then weaponizes them, but they're not very interested in solving the problems. They want them kept as victims because that's where they derive their power. I thought that was an interesting insight. But then you then apply it to the Jewish people. Again, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said to me, imagine if the Jewish people had played the victim card, because there has been no people anywhere, so far as I'm aware, down through history who have been as oppressed as the Jewish people have. I cannot come to grips with what happened in the Holocaust. I can't come to grips with the monsters who gassed innocent little boys and girls. I can't come to grips with the heartlessness of a regime that so destroyed its own people that, far from simply turning a blind eye to what was happening, the reality is that many, many thousands of Germans were actually so affected, their consciences so dulled, that they were prepared to participate in this murder, in this outrageous behaviour. So I think the general point I'm making is that if you're going to talk about who the real victims are, you might recognise the way the Jewish people have been treated by so many, including at times Christians, misguided Christianity, I would say, but it's happened. And you might also stop and think, well, they have not responded really with a victimhood mentality. Rather admirably, in many ways, the Jewish people have gone on, living, laughing, by and large, when they can. Gallows humour sometimes, I know. And have created a vibrant democracy in the Middle East, the only one. Apparently, we don't know enough about democracy in many quarters of Australia to understand that that's actually worth celebrating. It's the one country that, particularly if you were not a mainstream person, would actually let you live your life your own way and not throw you off a tall building because you dared to disagree, and where a woman's word is worth, I take it is in Israel, as much as a man's in a court of
Yeah.
law.
Sometimes more. No, my wife has more. My wife has more of a say in this house. So yeah.
I couldn't possibly comment.
But yeah, and you know, it's so weird also, and this is my last comment on the whole what the fact that in Israel right now we have a government that is very unpopular in polling, and I think just in general, for even before October 7th, if you've been following the whole judicial reform protests here, and we have a prime minister that's actually on trial, and he does 3 times a week he goes to testify now because it's his turn testifying in his own trial. So he's 3 days a week in court while there's wars all over the place. It's a very interesting dynamic. So he's very unpopular, it seems, at this point. And if the elections were held tomorrow, he would probably lose. And so most Israelis are very critical of their own government. And I think that's what democracies are. Like, we don't have to agree with our leaders to appreciate what Israel is, for example, or why we are proud to be Israelis. When you ask Israelis whether they're proud to be Israelis, they're overwhelmingly proud. And I think we're the only Western country with well above replacement rate birth rates here. Overwhelmingly, Israelis believe in God and are traditional in the way they live their lives. We can have again a lot of criticism about the way things are running here, but I think that the difference is that we understand why it's important to keep what we have here going, and not and I think in a way I'm very proud of Israel in that sense, that Israelis have a lot of political divisions and we're very annoyed at a lot of things that are happening, but we understand the big thing, that it's good to be here, we're fighting for the right things. And so do you, is that something that you think places like Australia, Europe, America should learn from us in any way, or am I reaching too far?
No, I think there's a justification for what you're saying, and I say that because you have had young men and women risking their lives to defeat an enemy that is intent. I mean, this is a great inversion of reality that people have participated in. People who are intent on wiping you out have genocidal intent written into their charter, while people lazily accuse Israel of being intent on genocide. It's an absurdity. It's an obscenity. But you know, the fact that you have young men and women who are patriotic enough, we were talking about that a moment ago, to see the value of their homeland, because I'm a believer that we've never perfected, or we've never found a better platform for freedom and prosperity on the back of an engaged and informed citizenry than the nation state. And the best way to run the nation state is democratically, point of a pencil, not a gun. And the best way for it to prosper is to allow free enterprise with some boundaries, to see people generate ideas and carry them forward and create wealth and trade. So, no, I get what you're on about, and I do indeed think that it is a remarkable thing when, just as the young men of Britain, you know, opposed the Nazis over the skies of Germany, having only said a few years before that they wouldn't fight and die for king and country, and you know, escorting the convoys in from America so that people could eat, and fighting in the North African desert to make sure Germany, you know, couldn't obtain the oil and what have you from your region for their war effort. Yeah, I have we lost that ability? Would we now defend to the death the things that gave our, you know, vulnerable people freedom and opportunity, and young people a future? I don't know. I hope we would, but you're showing that many Israelis are prepared to, and many of them have lost their lives in pursuit of that. We
Yes, I
forget
have
that.
a few friends that lost legs and arms, and it's pretty amazing. There's one guy that lost both legs, and he has 4 children. And I saw him speaking with his family. I know him a little bit, but they were also interviewing on TV, and he said, "I'm so happy. I was able to give for myself, and I have this amazing family, and I have not like." And I was thinking to myself, this is like I wish I was like him. Not that I wish I would lose my limbs, but that I would find, I think, meaning. He understands that his legs didn't come off for nothing. He was there for a higher cause. It was there to protect his family that he's now with. And it's something that it's the highest pinnacle of, I don't know. I don't know what the right word is, but I wish I would be in that mindset. And I'm not sure I can get there, but yeah, it's pretty amazing the people that have come out of this war and the heroes, and even on the day of October 7th, people who just went down there to try to save people, like took their own car and just drove 4 hours down south and just started putting people in their car and driving away to safety while people are shooting at them. It's mind blowing. It's like, I don't know.
Well, we are all capable of great nobility. We're all capable of great cowardice. We're all capable of acts of selflessness and acts of total selfishness. It's really a choice in the end. And courage is probably not so much knowing no fear as overcoming fear. So,
John, can I ask you lastly, the organization that you're part of, ARC, can you talk a little bit about, with for those you just, I have a few friends that went to the British, there was the big conference that was in the UK. I think you went there too. Um, why is it, what exactly is ARC? I mean, just for me that I don't understand. And um, do you think that it would have a place in Israel? I'm just thinking as we're going, like, is there a place for something like that here?
well, yes, I was involved from the beginning. ARC stands for Alliance of Responsible Citizens. It's that notion I touched on at the moment. Our citizens at the moment in the West feel disengaged, they feel cynical. It is, in fact, an age when they don't engage. And that's terrible because a democracy depends upon people being committed to it and doing their bit, manning their station. But basically, our theme is that decline is not inevitable, that we ought to believe in our core values. And we're not a political organisation or a religious organisation, although hopefully we inform both with facts and with research and with the best thinking of the times. We have an Australian version called Aspire. We'll be holding, we have had an ARC conference here, but our approach, if you like, inspired by ARC, is to do it our way and to focus on the Australian characteristics, if you like, or the problems that we all face, but do it in a way that's relevant to Australia. So the Australian one, for example, will be looking at our story, the thing that you and I have been talking about, why we ought to value it, not decry it. We'll be looking at why our young people lack resilience and are so anxious, because this is critical to our future. We'll be looking at, in Australia, we have a housing problem. So housing, immigration, family formation. Then we'll be looking at energy. Our higher energy costs are crippling business and are likely to choke off the next industrial revolution, AI and digital, even though we're a bit wary about them, and defence. You know, we live in very uncertain times, and yet, I mean, here's a thought, really. The government had commissioned a report into how to handle anti-Semitism in Australia. They got a report 5 or 6 months ago and sat on it. And now they're having to drag it out. It was put together, spearheaded by a Jewish lady called Gillian Siegel. So they sat on that, and then we, looked hopeless. And they did look hopeless, absolutely flat-footed, flummoxed, unable to show empathy even when the terrible tragedy happened. People might be sobered to recognise that they also commissioned a report a lot longer ago called the Defence Strategic Review. And it outlined the worrying circumstances we face and how a major step up in military preparedness was needed urgently. Well, that was 4 years ago. Imagine how sheepish the senior ministers of this government are going to look if there's a disturbance to our north.
Mm-hmm. The North is China?
Well, it's a lot of countries to the north, and it also is the South China Seas. Wouldn't have to be much of an interruption for a trading nation like ours,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden, we're in trouble. But Australia's geography means that in any conflict over Taiwan, we would be, let's say, the focus of a great deal of attention from the major
Yes.
protagonists. And I find it unbelievable that the government has ignored its own commissioned research and report into what ought to be done. 4 or 5
Yeah.
years ago, uh, it's bad enough that they did it for 5 or 6 months with the attempt to tackle anti-Semitism.
Yeah. This is the last thing, because as you're saying, I was thinking about it. How could it be that Australia keeps on electing this left-wing government? Meaning, we saw in America Trump, in a lot of Europe, the right has ascended. In France, it seems that the right is very popular now. In the UK, you have Nigel Farage's party leading in the polls, and yet Australia had an election not too long ago, and this government won again. It seems to me pretty handily. Thank God, I think your Green Party, the crazy Green Party, lost all the seats, if I understand. But the party seems to still be, the government seems to win over and over again. How do you? Is there any logical explanation? Do you think?
Regrettably, I'm afraid I think there is. It's not dissimilar to what happened in Britain. Uh, in Britain, you had a Conservative government that wasn't conservative, that lost control of its finances, that looked like Labor light, and people said, "Oh, we might as well have Labor." And I'm afraid there's a bit of a parallel here. The coalition, I've been out of public life for 18 years, but the coalition in many ways, I'm afraid during the 9 years that it was in power, um, it spent more money than it should have. And COVID was a problem, I know. There are a whole range of things that made it unpopular, so people went to Labor. And then last time round, the coalition didn't look like it had a real plan, even though the polls showed it could win. A real plan to confront the problems that are worrying Australia, cost of living, housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They should have been more worried about defence, but it's hard to get that recognised. And what needs to be remembered, though, is that their primary vote, that shows you how many people actually wanted this government as a first priority, was really only about a third of the voting Australians. Same as Britain. It was a record low number. It just produced, because of our rather unusual preferential system, produced an extraordinary result. There is another factor playing in Australia's against hard-nosed assessment of reality, if I can put it that way. We don't do hard-nosed assessment of realities anymore in Australia. Well, a lot of Australians do, but not enough of them. And I think it's because it's been so easy for so long. This has been a very fortunate country. There have been books written called The Lucky Country, and everything's fallen in our lap, and people have assumed it's easy. I noticed that when I did not contest the '07 election, I decided I'd been in cabinet for 10 years, and that was a great privilege. It was time for me to go out to pasture and pursue a private life again. But the government that I was part of was thrown out. And I think in part, what then stunned people was that the next Prime Minister had been assumed that he would be like our Prime Minister when I was in government, and that he'd be just as competent, but he'd be a bit more gentle around the edges. And in fact, he absolutely floundered. He found the job beyond him, and they
Who was
replaced
the
him in
prime
record
minister?
time.
For those who don't
Right?
know, who are you talking about? For
That was Kevin Rudd, who's
uh
now the Australian High Commissioner to America, where I think in some ways he shows enormous intellectual aptitude for the job. He certainly understands China.
mhm.
But his own party, he came in with the highest popularity records numbers of any Australian Prime Minister, as I understand it, and it collapsed within months. Within months. And then the Labor Party changed leaders. Then they changed back because that didn't work. And we had revolving door prime ministerships for quite a while. That's been very destabilising. And I don't know that enough of us have learnt the lesson. We face very challenging times. Government is hard. You need a competent, tight cabinet if you're to ever achieve anything. Splintering the vote into minor parties and in this country, so-called teals and what have you, breaking it all up, just simply guarantees that you won't get effective government. And that's what's happening.
The Honorable John Anderson. Truly pleasure to speak with you. By the way, when are you planning to come to Israel at any point? We would love to have you.
I'm ashamed to admit that I've been asked many times by many Jewish friends, and somehow or other, it's never happened. I'm not a globe-trotting type, I have to say. Uh, but I do say to your listeners, you're a democracy, you're a spirited people, you're a gutsy people, and I believe in the state of Israel. Uh, Hang on to your democracy with all the vigor you can, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much, John Anderson. Truly pleasure to speak with you. And if you do decide to come, you are more than welcome. Would love to even organize an event with you, whatever you want, and show you around. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been an honor.